Everyone told me I was doing well. That was the first problem. Whenever I shared even a hint of doubt, it was quickly corrected by reassurance. You've got everything figured out. People would kill to be in your position. You should be proud of yourself. So I learned to stop talking. Not because they were wrong but because they were right in a way that left no room for my truth. I had built the life I was supposed to want. The right milestones, reached in the right order. The kind of life that looks impressive when listed out loud. The kind that earns nods of approval instead of questions. I followed the script carefully. And somewhere along the way, I stopped checking whether I was still in the scene. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I was standing in my living room late at night. Lights off. City glowing outside the window. Everything around me was quiet, polished, controlled. And I felt nothing. Not sadness. Not anger. Just an unsettling absence. It was the kind of emptiness that doesn't hurt, which makes it harder to justify escaping it. I told myself this was what success felt like after the adrenaline faded. That fulfillment was something people exaggerated. That meaning was built slowly, through consistency, not emotion. I had become very good at rationalizing my own disappearance. Days blurred together. I woke up with purpose but without desire. Tasks got done. Goals were met. Progress continued just without my involvement. I started noticing how often I referred to my own life in passive terms. This is what I do. This is where I live. This is what comes next. Never, this is what I want. That question felt irrelevant, almost irresponsible. Wanting implies risk. Risk implies instability. And I had worked too hard to build stability. I remembered a time when my life felt alive with possibility. When decisions carried weight because they were chosen, not inherited. When failure felt acceptable because at least it was mine. That version of me didn't vanish dramatically. He was outgrown. Or so I told myself. In truth, I had buried him under responsibility. I began to understand that achievement can be a form of hiding. That progress can become a distraction when it moves faster than your self-awareness. Every promotion, every upgrade, every step forward made it harder to admit that I was no longer sure why I was moving at all. I stayed quiet because I didn't want to sound ungrateful. Gratitude became a muzzle. How could I explain to anyone that the life they admired felt foreign to me, that the success I worked for felt like a costume I forgot to take off? I didn't hate my life. That was the most confusing part. There was no urgency, no crisis demanding change. Just a persistent sense that I was living on behalf of expectations rather than instinct. I started feeling like a guest in my own routine. Like someone who arrived late to a party that had already peaked. At night, I lay awake replaying the path that led me here. Each decision made sense in isolation. Each choice was reasonable, defensible, smart. Together, they formed a life I no longer recognized as mine. The hardest realization came quietly: I wasn't trapped. I was invested. Invested in not disappointing people. Invested in maintaining momentum. Invested in the idea that stopping now would invalidate everything I had already done. So I kept going. Until one evening, standing alone in that same living room, I caught my reflection in the dark glass and felt a sudden, overwhelming clarity. If this life continued exactly as it was, I would succeed. And I would never arrive. That thought didn't panic me. It devastated me. Because it meant the problem wasn't my circumstances. It was my consent. I had agreed to live a life that looked right without asking whether it felt right. And I had been doing it for so long that stopping felt dangerous. But continuing suddenly felt impossible. That was the moment I understood something that changed everything: you can build a life that impresses everyone and still quietly lose yourself inside it. And once you see that truth, you don't unsee it. After that realization, I tried to ignore it. Not deny it, ignore it. Like you ignore a low pain you hope will fade if you don't touch it. I filled my days with motion. Meetings. Errands. Plans stacked on top of plans. I told myself momentum was proof that everything was fine. But momentum without direction only takes you further away from yourself. I started noticing how often I felt irritated by things that never used to bother me. Small delays. Casual questions. Conversations that required enthusiasm I no longer felt. I wasn't angry at people. I was angry at the role I was playing. A role that required calm certainty. A role that rewarded consistency over curiosity. A role that didn't allow space for doubt. Doubt had become dangerous. Because doubt implied that the life I had built might need revision, and revision threatened everything I had invested in. I realized how much my identity was tied to progress. How often I measured my worth by movement, forward, upward, outward. Standing still felt like failure. Turning back felt like shame. So I kept moving. But something strange happened. The more I advanced, the less connected I felt. Achievements landed softly, like they belonged to someone else. Compliments slid off me without impact. Success felt abstract, real on paper, distant in experience. I began to feel fraudulent in a way I couldn't explain. Not because I hadn't earned what I had, but because I no longer knew why I was earning it. At night, the questions returned. If I stopped tomorrow, who would I be if none of this existed? What would remain? Do I even recognize the person benefiting from all this effort? Those questions didn't have answers. They had weight. I noticed how often I avoided silence, how quickly I reached for distraction the moment a gap appeared in my day. Silence had become confrontational. In silence, I felt the distance between who I was and who I was expected to be. I remembered a version of myself who made choices impulsively, not recklessly, but honestly. Who allowed curiosity to guide decisions instead of fear of consequence. That version felt naive now. And yet, alive. I started grieving that version quietly. Not openly. Not dramatically. Just a dull sadness that followed me like a shadow. I tried to tell myself that growth requires sacrifice. That everyone gives something up. That life narrows as it stabilizes. But deep down, I knew the difference between narrowing and suffocating. I wasn't choosing less. I was choosing nothing. One evening, I sat with someone who was excitedly talking about future plans, promotions, investments, long-term strategies. I nodded, contributed at the right moments, said all the correct things. Inside, I felt panic rise. Not fear of failure, fear of permanence. I suddenly understood that what terrified me wasn't making the wrong choice. It was making the same one forever. That thought followed me home and refused to leave. I realized how much my life depended on inertia. How many decisions continued simply because they had already begun. How often I justified staying on a path because I was too far in to reconsider. That logic felt solid. It was also a trap. I started imagining my life 10 years ahead, unchanged. Not worse. Not better. Just, continued. The image felt unbearable. I began to understand something crucial: stability without alignment eventually turns into a slow form of despair. Not dramatic. Not visible. But deeply corrosive. I asked myself a question I had avoided for years: if no one was watching, would I still choose this life? The answer came immediately. No. That answer scared me more than anything else. Because it meant the life I was living required an audience. It needed validation to exist. And I was tired of performing. I began pulling back in small, almost invisible ways. I stopped volunteering explanations. Stopped filling silence with reassurance. Stopped correcting people when they assumed I was happy. Those small acts felt rebellious. They also felt honest. People started noticing the change. Not directly but subtly. Conversations shifted. Expectations hesitated. The smooth surface of my life developed hairline cracks. I felt guilty for that. Guilt had always kept me in place. But now, guilt competed with something stronger. A need to breathe. I realized that I wasn't afraid of losing what I had built. I was afraid of admitting that it had cost me more than I was willing to keep paying. That fear sat with me for a long time. Until one quiet night, alone, I admitted something out loud for the first time: this life works. But it doesn't work for me. Hearing it spoken felt like crossing a border. There was no going back to ignorance. From that moment on, every day I stayed exactly the same felt like a conscious choice. And conscious choices demand accountability. I didn't know yet what I would change. I didn't have a plan. I didn't even know what I wanted instead. But I knew this: continuing without consent was no longer an option. And once you understand that, the life you've built starts to feel fragile, not because it's wrong, but because it's no longer true. I didn't tear my life down. That would have looked dramatic enough to justify everything. What I did instead was more uncomfortable. I stopped pretending that I was fulfilled. I stopped smoothing over the unease with logic. Stopped calling discipline purpose. Stopped confusing admiration with belonging. That decision didn't feel brave. It felt destabilizing. Because once I admitted the truth to myself, every part of my life had to answer a question it had never been asked before: why are you here? Some things had no answer. I began noticing how many parts of my life existed purely because they had always existed. How many routines continued out of habit rather than intention. How often I said yes simply to preserve momentum. Momentum had been my greatest ally and my quiet enemy. It kept me moving forward without asking whether I was still headed somewhere I wanted to arrive. I started making changes so small they barely looked like changes at all. I declined opportunities that would have once flattered me. I stopped planning years ahead just to feel secure. I let silence linger instead of filling it with confident explanations. People noticed. Not in confrontational ways. In glances. In pauses. In the subtle recalibration of expectations. Some respected it. Some questioned it. Some withdrew when they realized I was no longer playing the role they had grown comfortable with. That hurt more than I expected. But it also revealed something I needed to see. Much of my value to others had been tied to my predictability. When I stopped being predictable, the relationships that remained were quieter but more real. There were nights when doubt returned full force. Nights when I stared at the ceiling wondering if I had misunderstood myself. If this restlessness was just another form of dissatisfaction that would follow me anywhere. But then I noticed something important. Even in doubt, I felt present. Unsettled but present. Afraid but present. Uncertain but present. I hadn't felt that in years. Presence, I realized, isn't comfort. It's honesty. Starting over didn't look like reinvention. It looked like subtraction. Removing layers of expectation. Letting go of identities that had outlived their usefulness. Accepting that some successes were no longer relevant to who I was becoming. That acceptance came with grief. Grief for the time I couldn't recover. Grief for the version of myself who believed endurance was the same as meaning. Grief for the life that worked well enough to keep me trapped. I let myself feel that grief. Not to punish myself but to mark the ending. Endings deserve acknowledgement, even quiet ones. As the noise faded, something else emerged. A different relationship with time. Days stopped rushing past me. Decisions slowed. I became more attentive to what drained me and what quietly sustained me. I stopped measuring my life by how impressive it looked and started measuring it by how aligned it felt. Alignment doesn't announce itself. It's subtle. Almost boring. But it's steady. I learned that fulfillment isn't a constant state. It's not something you achieve and then keep. It's something you check in with repeatedly and adjust when it starts to drift. I stopped asking whether my life made sense to others. I asked whether it made sense to me. That question simplified everything. Some doors closed for good. Some opportunities passed without return. Some people never understood why I would step away from a life that worked. I don't try to convince them. Because I finally understand something I wish I had learned earlier: a life can function perfectly and still be wrong for you. There is no failure in admitting that. There is only honesty. If you're listening to this and something inside you feels slightly misaligned, not broken, not desperate, just off, don't wait for collapse. You don't need a breakdown to justify a course correction. You don't need permission to question a life you've outgrown. And you don't need to destroy everything to change direction. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is stop living for an audience. I didn't abandon my life because it was a mistake. I abandoned it because it was finished. And finishing something that no longer fits you isn't quitting. It's making space. Now, my life is quieter. Less impressive. Less predictable. But it's mine. And for the first time, when I wake up in the morning, I don't feel like I'm stepping into someone else's expectations. I feel like I'm arriving. Not at a destination. But at myself. That isn't a triumphant ending. It's a true one. And that after everything is enough.